What if the way Russians loved, married, and desired each other for the last 300 years was shaped less by nature and more by the decisions of a handful of rulers? Before Peter the Great declared Russia an empire, before the Bolsheviks tried to abolish the family itself, before Stalin reversed everything, Russian intimacy followed its own quiet rhythm, dictated by village priests and centuries of unwritten custom. Over the next few minutes, we will travel across 3 centuries from 1721 to 2026 to see how love, marriage, and sexuality were built, broken, and rebuilt again in Russia, and why the biggest transformation happened far more recently than most people assume. This is not a story about one single fixed Russian tradition passed quietly down through generations. It is a story about how quickly an entire culture's most private habits can be rewritten from above, again and again, by war, revolution, ideology, and now rapidly advancing technology. We will begin in the villages and churches of early Imperial Russia, where sex was governed almost entirely by the Orthodox Church, and by tradition rather than law. Then we will move through the glittering, contradictory world of the Russian Empire, into the shocking sexual experiments of the early Soviet Union, the brutal crackdown under Stalin, the quiet stagnation of the later Soviet decades, the sudden opening of Glasnost, the chaos of the 1990s, the conservative turn under Putin, and finally, the tightly controlled, digitally connected Russia of today. By the end, you will understand exactly how a nation's private life can be rewritten again and again by history's biggest forces, and why no single generation of Russians has ever lived under the same rules as the one before it. Grandmothers, mothers, and daughters within the very same family often grew up in what amounted to 3 completely different sexual cultures, separated by only a few short decades each. Before 1721, Russia was not yet an empire. It was a patchwork of principalities bound together by Orthodox Christianity, where the church, not the state, decided what happened in the bedroom. There was no single legal code covering marriage or desire. Village elders, priests, and centuries-old peasant customs quietly ruled over who could marry whom, when, and how children were raised. Marriages were arranged early, often in the teenage years, because a household needed labor and a family needed heirs, not because 2 people had fallen in love. Sexuality was almost never discussed openly. It was assumed, managed, and hidden, wrapped tightly inside the institution of marriage and the authority of the church. Confession, penance, and church courts quietly policed adultery, illegitimacy, and anything considered sinful behavior. And a person standing in the community depended heavily on visible conformity to these unwritten rules. But then, a young, restless Tsar returned from touring Western Europe with radical new ideas, and everything about Russian society, including its most private corners, began to change. In 1721, Peter the Great declared Russia an empire, and with that declaration came a deliberate campaign to westernize every part of Russian life. He forced nobles to shave their beards, wear European clothing, and adopt European manners, including how men and women interacted socially. For the first time, Russian aristocratic women were pulled out of isolated harem chambers, the secluded quarters where noble women had traditionally lived apart from male society, and pushed into public assemblies where they danced, mingled, and conversed with men outside their families. This was revolutionary for a society that had kept elite women almost entirely hidden from public life. Peter's reforms did not create a sexual revolution overnight, but they cracked open a door that had been sealed for centuries. Courtship among the elites slowly began to resemble the flirtatious, socially visible customs of Western European courts, complete with dancing, letters, and public flirtation. But something unexpected happened alongside this openness. The state itself began asserting new authority over marriage, requiring official registration and inserting itself into decisions, once left entirely to families and priests. And that was not the biggest change to come, because while the aristocracy experimented with European manners, the vast majority of Russians, the peasants, remained bound to a completely different world of tradition and control that Peter's reforms barely touched, creating a cultural split between elite and ordinary Russia that would persist for the next 2 centuries. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, Imperial Russia developed a striking double standard between its aristocracy and its peasantry. In the glittering court circles of St. Petersburg, extramarital affairs among aristocrats were an open secret, tolerated as long as appearances were maintained and scandal stayed private. Catherine the Great herself, one of history's most powerful women, openly took a series of lovers while ruling one of the largest empires on earth, and her court simply adapted to it, treating her personal life as a matter of political gossip rather than moral outrage. Yet for the overwhelming peasant majority, life looked nothing like this. Peasant sexuality remained tightly regulated by Orthodox tradition, arranged marriages, and the practical demands of agricultural survival, where early marriage and childbearing were economic necessities, not romantic choices, and where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to work and bear children. But something unexpected happened as the empire modernized. Writers, doctors, and reformers in the mid-1800s began publicly discussing sexuality, prostitution, and marriage as social problems rather than purely private or religious matters, and the state even began licensing and regulating prostitution in major cities as a public health measure. Russian literature, from Tolstoy to Chekhov to Dostoevsky, began exploring desire, infidelity, and repression with startling honesty, holding a mirror up to a society that preferred to pretend such things did not exist. Doctors and journalists debated venereal disease, urban poverty, and moral decay in the same breath, treating sexuality for the first time as a topic worthy of public policy rather than private shame alone. And that was not the biggest change on the horizon, because by the early 20th century, an entirely new intellectual movement was preparing to question marriage itself. In the final decades before the Revolution, Russia experienced what historians call the Silver Age, a period of extraordinary artistic and intellectual ferment centered in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. Poets, philosophers, and radical thinkers openly debated free love, gender equality, and the future of the family in salons, journals, and university lecture halls. Feminist and socialist circles argued that traditional marriage was a form of economic and sexual bondage, particularly for women who had almost no legal or financial independence from their husbands. Meanwhile, sexology as a modern science was beginning to take root across Europe, and Russian intellectuals eagerly imported these ideas, discussing homosexuality, contraception, and female desire in ways that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. But something unexpected happened beneath the surface of this intellectual excitement. Ordinary Russian life, especially in the countryside where the vast majority of the population still lived, remained largely untouched by these debates, still governed by church, custom, and necessity, exactly as it had been for generations. The distance between a Moscow salon debating free love and a village where marriages were still arranged by parents had perhaps never been wider in Russian history. And that gap between elite theory and everyday reality was about to be violently erased. Because in 1917, revolution swept away not just the Tsar, but the entire legal foundation of Russian family life. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they treated the traditional family as a relic of capitalist oppression that needed to be dismantled alongside the monarchy and the church. Within months, the new Soviet government legalized divorce on demand through a simple postcard notification, decriminalized homosexuality, legalized abortion, years before most of the Western world would even consider it, and stripped the Orthodox Church of all authority over marriage and family law. Revolutionary theorists like Alexandra Kollontai argued publicly that love should be free from jealousy, ownership, and rigid marital bonds, proposing that comradely relationships could replace traditional possessive romance entirely, and that the state, not the individual family, should raise and support children through communal kitchens and childcare. For a brief extraordinary window, Soviet Russia became one of the most sexually progressive societies on Earth, at least on paper, drawing fascinated attention from reformers around the world. But something unexpected happened as this experiment unfolded in the real world. The collapse of stable marriage structures during a time of famine, civil war, and economic collapse left staggering numbers of abandoned women and orphaned children roaming the streets of Soviet cities, and Communist Party leaders grew increasingly alarmed at the social cost of their own reforms. Some officials even worried openly that the new sexual freedom was distracting young workers from building socialism, sparking heated debates in party newspapers about whether desire itself needed to be disciplined for the good of the revolution. And that crisis set the stage for one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of sexual policy anywhere in the world. By the 1930s, Joseph Stalin oversaw what historians now call the Great Retreat, a sweeping reversal of nearly every sexually progressive Bolshevik policy. Abortion, once freely legal, was banned outright in 1936, except in narrow medical circumstances, forcing countless women back toward dangerous illegal procedures. Divorce became expensive and bureaucratically difficult, discouraged through steep fees and public shame published in local newspapers. Homosexuality, decriminalized after the revolution, was recriminalized in 1933 and punished with years of hard labor in the Gulag system. State propaganda now glorified the traditional nuclear family, motherhood, and childbearing as patriotic duties, essential to building socialism and, later, to replacing populations devastated by war and Stalin's own purges. Medals were even created to honor mothers who bore 10 or more children for the state. The government, that once promised liberation from marriage, now demanded reproduction as a civic obligation, enforced through law, taxation, and social pressure. But something unexpected happened even under this iron control. Private desire never fully disappeared. It simply moved underground, expressed in whispered conversations, secret relationships, and a growing gap between official Soviet morality and lived reality. Ordinary citizens learned to keep two separate lives, one public and obedient, one private and unspoken, a habit that would outlast Stalin himself by decades. And that gap would only widen as the decades passed, because after Stalin's death, Soviet society entered a strange new era of enforced silence rather than open terror. In the decades following Stalin, Soviet authorities did not restore the sexual freedoms of the 1920s, but they also stepped back from the harshest terror of the 1930s. What emerged instead was a culture of profound public silence around sexuality that would last for a generation. Sex education in schools was virtually non-existent, leaving young people to learn about their own bodies through rumor, folklore, and whispered advice from friends. Media, film, and literature avoided explicit sexual content almost entirely, reinforcing the popular Soviet-era phrase that would later become internationally famous during a televised debate. There is no sex in the Soviet Union. Contraception remained scarce and unreliable, making abortion, though legal again after 1955, the primary method of birth control for millions of Soviet women, often repeated many times over a single lifetime with real consequences for women's health. Housing shortages forced multiple generations to share cramped communal apartments, leaving young couples with almost no private space for intimacy or even honest conversation. But something unexpected happened despite this suffocating official silence. An underground culture of samizdat literature, banned foreign records, private jokes, and quiet nonconformity kept alive conversations that the state refused to have publicly. Doctors, teachers, and even Communist Party officials often relied on this same informal underground knowledge in their own private lives, quietly contradicting the very silence their institutions enforced in public. And that underground current was about to collide head-on with a wave of dramatic political change that no one fully expected. When Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika in the mid-1980s, decades of enforced silence broke open almost overnight. Soviet television broadcast its first frank public discussions of sexuality, and audiences reacted with a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and fascination after living for so long without such conversations. Western films, magazines, and eventually pornography began seeping across borders that had been sealed for generations, arriving through informal networks long before the state could regulate them. Sex education, sexology research, and public health campaigns around sexually transmitted infections finally entered mainstream Soviet discourse, partly driven by the emerging global AIDS crisis, which forced even a reluctant government to speak plainly about sex for the sake of public health. For the first time in half a century, ordinary Soviet citizens could openly discuss desire, relationships, and bodies without immediate fear of official punishment, and a wave of new magazines and talk shows rushed to fill the silence. But something unexpected happened as this opening accelerated. The very political system enabling it was collapsing beneath its own weight, unable to hold together the economic and political pressures building around it. Newspapers that had spent decades avoiding the subject now ran surveys, advice columns, and investigative pieces asking Soviet citizens what they actually wanted from their intimate lives, questions the state had never bothered to ask before. And that collapse would trigger not a gentle continuation of reform, but a chaotic, unregulated explosion of everything the Soviet Union had spent 70 years suppressing. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, Russia plunged into a decade of extraordinary social and economic chaos, and its sexual culture transformed just as dramatically and just as suddenly. Censorship collapsed almost entirely, seemingly overnight. Pornography, once smuggled in secret under coats and inside luggage, flooded newsstands and later the early internet completely openly. Advertising, film, and popular music embraced sexuality with a boldness that stunned older generations raised on decades of official silence and careful propriety. At the same time, the collapse of the Soviet social safety net created devastating consequences, including a surge in human trafficking, sex work driven by economic desperation and unemployment, and a public health crisis as HIV infection rates climbed sharply through the 1990s amid crumbling healthcare infrastructure. Dating and relationships increasingly reflected raw market logic, as economic survival became intertwined with romantic and sexual choices for millions of Russians navigating hyperinflation and mass unemployment. But something unexpected happened amid this chaos. A new generation was coming of age with radically different expectations about openness, choice, and personal freedom than any generation before them, shaped by satellite television and early access to the wider world. For many young Russians, the freedom of the 1990s felt exhilarating and terrifying at once. A total absence of the rules that had structured every previous generation's private life. And as the new millennium began, the Russian state was preparing to reassert control once again. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia entered the 21st century with growing economic stability after the chaos of the 1990s, but also a deliberate ideological turnback toward conservative, state-sanctioned traditional values. The government increasingly aligned itself with the Orthodox Church, promoting policies framed around patriotic family growth and reversing the country's shrinking population through financial incentives for childbearing. Public discourse around LGBTQ rights tightened dramatically, culminating in the widely criticized 2013 law banning so-called propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships toward minors, which international observers said effectively silenced open discussion of LGBTQ life altogether in schools, media, and public events. State media increasingly portrayed Western sexual liberalism as a moral threat to Russian civilization, framing traditional gender roles and childbearing as pillars of national identity, distinct from a supposedly declining West. Yet privately, internet access was exploding across the country, connecting young Russians to global culture, dating apps, and international communities faster than any government could fully control or monitor. But something unexpected happened as these two forces collided. A widening gap emerged between official state messaging broadcast on television and the private, increasingly online lives of ordinary Russians scrolling through their phones. Surveys from this period repeatedly showed younger urban Russians holding views on relationships and gender roles far closer to their European peers than to official state rhetoric, even as that same rhetoric grew louder. And that gap set the stage for the most rapidly changing chapter in this entire 300-year story. By the 2020s, the internet had fundamentally rewired how Russians met, dated, and understood relationships and sexuality, even as official policy pushed firmly in the opposite direction. Dating apps, encrypted messaging, and international streaming platforms gave young Russians access to global conversations about identity, consent, and relationships that state television would never broadcast or even acknowledge. At the same time, further legal restrictions expanded significantly, including a 2023 Supreme Court ruling and subsequent laws that criminalized what officials called the international LGBT movement as extremist, pushing already limited public expression even further underground and into private, encrypted spaces. Artificial intelligence began reshaping private life in entirely new ways by the mid-2020s. From AI companionship apps offering conversation and connection to isolated users, to algorithmically curated dating platforms, to encrypted spaces where conversations about identity and desire could happen with far greater privacy than any previous generation of Russians had ever known, even under the watchful eye of an increasingly digital state. The contrast became stark, a state doubling down on traditional, tightly controlled public messaging and legislation, and a population increasingly living a parallel private life shaped by global technology that no border could fully seal off. By 2026, Russian sexuality exists in this unresolved tension, caught between 3 centuries of state control and a digitally connected generation determined to define intimacy on its own terms, whatever the law says on paper. Whether that tension eases or hardens further in the years ahead may depend less on tradition than on how much of daily life the state can realistically follow into private, encrypted, algorithmically shaped spaces. Most people assume Russia's sexual culture was always deeply conservative, shaped only by tradition and religion. But history tells a far stranger story. For a brief moment in the 1920s, Soviet Russia experimented with some of the most radical ideas about love and family ever attempted by any government on Earth, before reversing course more dramatically than almost any other nation in modern history, swinging from radical liberation to strict enforced conservatism within less than 2 decades. Let's move quickly through everything we've covered. In 1721, Peter the Great cracked open Russian court life to European influence, pulling elite women into public society for the first time. Through the 1700s and 1800s, aristocrats lived by very different rules than peasants, while writers and reformers began questioning marriage itself as an institution. In 1917, the Bolsheviks tried to abolish the traditional family entirely, legalizing divorce, abortion, and homosexuality almost overnight. In the 1930s, Stalin reversed nearly every one of those reforms and criminalized homosexuality again while glorifying motherhood as a state duty. Through the mid-century decades, Soviet society enforced public silence while private life continued quietly underground. In the 1980s, Glasnost broke that silence wide open on national television. In the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union unleashed total chaos alongside total unregulated openness. From 2000 onward, the Russian state pushed back hard with conservative, tradition-focused policy and new restrictions. And now, in the 2020s, artificial intelligence and global technology are rewriting private life once again, faster than any government can fully control. Russian sexuality has never stayed the same. Across 300 years, it has been liberated, criminalized, silenced, and reinvented again and again, shaped by czars, revolutionaries, dictators, reformers, and now algorithms. The question is no longer whether Russian intimacy will keep changing, because history makes clear that it always does. The real question is what the next 100 years will look like, and who, if anyone, will get to decide, given that every ruler in this story who tried to permanently settle the matter ended up being overtaken by the next generation anyway. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden stories that shaped the world we live in today. And let us know in the comments which era in this 300-year story surprised you the most, and which one you think most resembles the world we're living in right now.